China's PLA flexes military muscles as Taiwan gears up for war games. The first post. China's Xi tells military to deepen war combat planning. Xinhua reports, says Reuters. Chinese President Xi Jinping praises military branch central to keeping up pressure on Taiwan, the South China Monitoring Post. Well, these were some of the dominant headlines on 6th of July as Chinese President Xi Jinping paid a visit to the Eastern Theater Command's headquarters. Now, this is the command that is in charge of the region around Taiwan. And while there, Xi warned about a new period of turmoil and change for the world. This warning also came just days before the annual Hankwang military exercises, and the live fire exercise component is scheduled for the end of July in Taiwan. The annual simulation focuses on defending the main international airport of Taiwan and how to keep the sea lanes open in the event of a Chinese blockade of this island that lies roughly 150 or less nautical miles from the coast of southeast China. Remember, the computerized war games will be conducted using the United States built Joint Theater Level Stimulation or the JTLS platform. Hi everyone, I'm Smita Sharma, and you're tuned in to our foreign policy podcast, Beyond Nation and State, on Suno India. You can also listen to all our episodes on Apple and Spotify. And on this episode today, we are talking about Taiwan that sits in the so-called first island chain. This includes a list of the US friendly territories that are crucial to US foreign policy. And any Chinese control or attack over Taipei could put Guam, Hawaii at risk too. The founding father of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao Zedong, made it clear that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan is ours, and we will never compromise on the issue, which is an issue of internal affairs. Mao had warned against any foreign aggression or interference, comparing his enemies to flies. On this tiny globe, a few flies dashed themselves against the wall, he said, unquote. So on episode 8 of Beyond Nation and State, I take a look at the historical complexities of Taiwan, the existential threats that it faces, what is at stake in Taiwan for the world's two most consequential geopolitical and economic powers, United States and China, and what challenges it throws up for countries like India. I'm joined by Mr. Vijay Gokhale. He's a retired career diplomat, former envoy to Malaysia, Germany, and China. He retired as a foreign secretary after a career of nearly 3 decades in the diplomatic services. He's also an author of 3 important books for all studying China and Chinese history and strategy: Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, and after Tiananmen, The Rise of China. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. A prolific writer, he has also authored an important working paper for Carnegie, What Should India Do Before the Next Taiwan Strait Crisis? And I will come to that paper in a little bit in this conversation. But Ambassador Gokhale, firstly, thank you so much for agreeing to be here with us on Beyond Nation and State.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
If I could start by gauging your reaction to a recent event. We saw Xi Jinping's recent statements after his visit to the Eastern Theater Command. Do you perceive it as a continued posturing, especially, of course, given that Tepe's annual military exercise is coming up? Or do you feel that he has upped the ante even more?
Smita, when a political leader, whether that leader belongs to an authoritarian system or a democratic system, visits their military facilities or military units, it is usually the case that they will talk national security. Therefore, when President Xi Jinping makes such comments as we should prepare for war or that we should ensure that our national security is upgraded at military facilities, we should not overinterpret that statement. Nonetheless, of course, there is a pattern to these statements, inasmuch as over the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen President Xi Jinping making such statements on more than one occasion. And I think he is preparing both the military and the population for the possibility of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. That does not mean, however, that China would start that crisis. It may or may not. But I think it has to prepare for that eventuality. And I think this is the real significance of those statements that the president of China is making when he visits military establishments or talks of national security.
How much of this preparation is also triggered by these reports that we continuously read about, that the Chinese economy is facing a slower growth post the pandemic? In the neocons in the United States, the neocon approach policy, we would always see that there would be an external aggression, a war to also try and divert of attention from, of course, domestic concerns. Here is an increasing sort of a pitch and assertiveness on Taiwan, also driven by the recent economic sort of growth. It's a downward slide for China, within itself, the internal challenges it faces.
Well, it is not unlikely that, as in the past, countries which are facing internal difficulties raise the specter of external threat. But in this particular case, it has been the consistent position of all leaders of China, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, that reunification with Taiwan is a core objective of the Communist Party and of the Chinese state. And therefore, you will see similar statements at times of crisis by Mao as well as Deng as well as Xi Jinping. I don't think one should make too much of immediate statements, but there is no doubt that the situation in the Taiwan Straits today, the general geopolitical situation around that strait, is perhaps as tense as it might have been in the 1950s. And those were the years when two major crises took place. Neither resulted in large scale conflict, but the world came close to conflict. And therefore, the paper I wrote was really to flag that if you look at the totality of circumstances, you have to presume that the situation in the Taiwan Strait is not normal, and that contingency plans need to be put into place by any country or any economy which might be affected by it.
Because you did mention, of course, that these are statements on reunification, positions taken across the generation of Chinese leaders, starting, of course, from Chairman Mao himself. So this is not Xi's really personal vision. This is a party principle. But do you see an increased aggravation in terms of the projection of this idea under Xi?
I do. And I say this because as China nears its second centenary goal, which is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 2049, it becomes increasingly difficult for the leadership to explain to their own people why such a dominant power, why such a country which is seeking to be the number one country in the world cannot reunify a part of its own territory which is less than 150 nautical miles off its coast. In a sense, the Chinese state and public opinion feel incomplete because this small island, which by international declarations in Cairo in 1943 and Potsdam in 1945 should have reverted to China after the Second World War, continues to be autonomous or, within quotes, independent of the People's Republic of China. So I think in the light of this, as the time deadline nears of 2049, we will see a greater anxiety on part of the People's Republic of China to achieve their goal of reunification. Whether that goal is achieved by force or whether it is achieved through other means, more peaceful means, is of course a matter for the future to decide.
So China, of course, has been continuously claiming that self-ruled Taiwan is actually a breakaway province. It has to be reunited. In the national interest, Jingao Zhu, he writes about the CCP's principle of unification with Taiwan and why the continuation of implementing this historical mission is unstoppable in the new era, is what he says. So he goes on to argue that relying solely on deterrence to stop Xi Jinping's ambition would be imprudent and could even jeopardize US national security. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think, first of all, as an Indian, it is important to state that we have in 1949 itself legally accepted the argument that Taiwan and the islands, the outer islands, are part of the People's Republic of China, which we have recognized as the legitimate government of China. That having been said, it has not meant that in the past we have therefore simply ignored the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, in as much as they affect the regional peace and stability. And therefore, if you look at it in that context, I think we must accept that what happens in the Taiwan Straits will be India's business. And by that same token, it will be the business of other interested parties, whether they are part of the region or not. Now, we can argue endlessly whether the United States is a resident power or an external power. They don't have territories in the Indo-Pacific besides Hawaii and Guam. So you could be stretching it by calling them a resident power. But there is no doubt that in terms of their military, in terms of their economy, in terms of their diplomacy, they have been front and center in the Indo-Pacific. They have vast interests in all areas, and therefore they are, to my way of thinking, a resident power. And as a resident power, perhaps the most dominant resident power in the region, I think it is reasonable for them to postulate that while it is preferable that China's unification with Taiwan is peaceful, they need to prepare for the possibility that China might take non-peaceful measures to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. So I think from that perspective, there are many scholars in the United States and outside which have talked about how to deal with an increasingly assertive China when it comes to the Taiwan Strait issue.
But we've also seen, of course, that China has been practicing these precision strikes, the blockades and drills around the island in April after Taiwan, the President Tsai met with the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The frequency of the Chinese military drills has increased over the past 3 to 4 years, something that you spoke about. So, looking at this argument from the Chinese prism, that this is basically a provocation from the US led West, what it calls the US hegemony. How do you look at the Chinese argument that they are being provoked?
I don't think that argument for me holds much water. And by the way, what they are doing with Taiwan, which is a slow and steady escalation of the situation, is being also done with other neighbors, including us. It is a Chinese tactic and perhaps a longer term strategy to increasingly normalize new developments along the maritime or land frontiers, which in time become the new normal. And therefore, I think what they are trying to do in the Taiwan Straits is to increasingly demonstrate that they can control the sovereign airspace or the sovereign sea space around Taiwan and get other countries to accept this as the normal situation. So, if you look at the actions that have been taken, I think these are all from the Chinese side. The Americans and perhaps a few other countries have been reactive in most cases.
So,
Now,
Quad to AUKUS is a reaction.
I would certainly say it is a reaction. It is a reaction not simply to the situation in the Taiwan Strait, but the manner in which China has engaged in certain maritime activities across the Indo-Pacific. It is a reaction to China's increasingly assertive behavior over the Senkaku Islands with Japan. It is a response to China's assertive behavior and the capture of atolls and reefs in the South China Sea and the building of military facilities on them. It is also a reaction to the fact that China, which has publicly stated for many decades that it will not station military forces abroad, has actually unveiled its first military base in Djibouti. That is a very far geographical distance from the Chinese mainland. And we now know from satellite and other imagery that a second naval base or a second logistics facility is coming up in Riem Naval Base in Cambodia. So, in a sense, it is a response across the board to what is seen as an assertive and, in some quarters, even perhaps an aggressive Chinese posture in the maritime domain.
Let me just rewind a little bit. You served as the head of the India Taipei Association in Taiwan from 2003 to 2007. Hu Jintao had taken over from Jiang Zemin. That period also corresponded with the economic emergence of China as a very significant power. We used to hear, of course, the statements from Hu Jintao to over Taiwan. He opposed any form of Taiwanese independence and any attempts to create what he called was two Chinas, one China, one Taiwan. But that already feels a very different era. Was there a significant different approach from Beijing at that point in time than what we see now?
That's an excellent question, Smita, because I think you have actually placed your finger on the issue. I was posted in Taipei during that time, and it was a very unusual time of transition. It was the first time that a non KMT president had been elected to power. Until the year 2000, all the presidents of the People's Republic of China, whether they were appointed or elected, came from the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party. And the Nationalist Party continues to believe that it is the legitimate government of the whole of China, and therefore it never spoke of so called Taiwan independence or of an independent identity of Taiwan. The DPP and the president of the DPP, Chen Shui-bian, who was elected in 2000 and was the president during my time in Taipei, in fact spoke the language of local identity. And for the Chinese, this was a matter of concern. Now, we seem to think that it is President Xi Jinping who has upped the ante on Taiwan. But in fact, it was President Hu Jintao who had to deal with the initial ramifications of this transition in Taiwan. And it is under President Hu Jintao that China's naval power was established, that China's naval mission was, in a sense, crafted, and where we see the first instances of a more assertive policy on Taiwan. It is logical that President Xi Jinping has built upon that because as time has gone by, we have seen a second DPP administration under the current President Tsai Ing-wen and an increasing assertion of Taiwanese identity. So I think what you have flagged is important. We are seeing a longer term historical trend, and it is important, therefore, not to attribute the crisis or the sense of crisis to the current president of Taiwan. Now, that is not to say that he is not being assertive or perhaps even aggravating the situation. But I think the point I'm making is that this whole process, this change in the Chinese approach, behavior, and actions began actually during the time of President Hu Jintao, and it was in direct response to the transition taking place where the local identity began to gain ground and thoughts of independence began to go mainstream.
But, Ambassador Gokhale, when you say that what you see now is a longer term historical crisis, second one again in the making, do you rule out any possibility of a peaceful triangulation sort of relations, the US, China, Taiwan coexisting? Is that a complete, of course, something that will never happen?
Well, theoretically, it's possible, and in diplomacy, one can never say something will never happen. But we must recognize that there is a young generation in Taiwan which is now for which now forms the bulk of the electorate. That is, people born after 1980, who have seen great prosperity, who have seen Taiwan regain some international status, who have seen the Taiwanese people respected abroad, and who have no familial connections, no family bonds with the mainland of China. They've never been there. Their relatives left almost 80 years ago. Their properties have been confiscated, presumably by the state, and don't exist anymore. So these are people rooted in Taiwan to Taiwanese identity, and they now form the majority of the electorate. In the light of this, I presume Chinese contingency planning will also assume that there could be a tipping point where more than 50% of the electorate feel that they are not part of the People's Republic of China, but that they are Taiwanese. So the point I'm making is that while we can't rule out a peaceful reunification of Taiwan, there are certain ground realities which suggest that that peaceful unification might not be as easy to achieve as it might have been, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. And added to that is the fact that the Chinese actions and activities over the last few years have not exactly been conducive to a peaceful reunification. Effectively, the one attractive aspect of Chinese policy was the one country, two systems idea that Deng Xiaoping had sold to the people of Hong Kong and Macau, namely that we are both belonging to one country, China, but I keep my communist system and you keep your Hong Kong democracy or Macau democracy. In the last 3 to 4 years, the laws and regulations and attitude of the Chinese state towards Hong Kong, whether it is in terms of freedom of speech, expression, assembly, and so on, has fundamentally altered, thereby reducing the attractiveness of this idea for the Taiwanese people. The Taiwanese people perhaps now feel that even if they were to accept this arrangement, it would be either terminated or significantly amended within a few years, and therefore there is a trust deficit as well. So I think actions by the Chinese state, both in terms of commission and omission, have contributed to the likelihood that a peaceful reunification may be more and more difficult.
Right. You've actually answered the question that I was going to ask you about what is the palpable change within Taiwan that you feel when it comes to its society. Also, for the young listeners of this podcast, let me remind you that Taiwan, of course, sees itself as distinct from the Chinese mainland. It has its own democratically elected leaders, its own constitution. But Ambassador Gokhale, when we try and talk about, of course, the changes in Taiwanese society, what is the change that you feel in the Chinese youth? In the youth in China itself during COVID lockdowns, the most stringent, the most continued ones, we saw images of protests coming out despite all that crackdown on internet, on social media, on communication links to the Chinese youth. Though today, do you find that perhaps there is a greater sense of that nationalism or that hyperbole within them too? How has Chinese society changed when it comes to their young?
Well, these changes are both in terms of their external view of the world as well as their domestic view, and these need to be separated. So far as their external view is concerned, at least two generations of Chinese from 1985 have been given patriotic education. In other words, it has been repeatedly emphasized through the textbooks that China was a victim, that the victims were the imperial powers as well as the neo-imperial powers, and those include countries like Japan and India, because we are also seen as part of the imperialist camp, and that therefore the Chinese now, with their economic prowess and their military strength, have the capacity to stand up and make China once again the center of the world. Now, when two generations of young Chinese are brought up on this view, and they have in their lives seen increasing prosperity and increasing respect given to them by others, it is natural that they have a sense that their due is not being given to them. And therefore, while nationalism is a trend in all rising powers, it is the case of China that nationalism is channelized into a more assertive behavior, into even a more aggressive behavior. And such assertion or aggression is admired. It is an admirable quality. The whole idea of Chinese diplomatic wolf warriors also, therefore, becomes an admirable quality. So, to answer your question, yes, there is certainly, as far as the external view is concerned, a highly nationalistic view about China's place in the world. Domestically speaking, however, I think we are at an interesting transition, and I don't want to say, because I don't know, whether it is a tipping point. But I think that after 30 years of continuous growth, which led the Chinese people to expect from their leaders that their life would become materially better each year and every year. We are now faced with a post COVID situation where there are significant downsides to the Chinese economy. I'm not just talking GDP numbers, I'm talking of employment figures, I'm talking of banking failures, I'm talking of a property collapse, I'm talking of a domestic consumption fall, which makes it difficult for China to return to the growth period before 2015. And therefore, we must presume there is dissatisfaction within that society. And we saw this expressed very clearly when the demonstrations took place in November 2022 over COVID. Now, the question is, are these sort of pockets of dissatisfaction large enough or broad enough to encompass society as a whole? And on that, I don't have an answer, because I think we need to watch what happens in China over the next maybe 2 to 3 years. But I believe these 2 to 3 years are really critical for China. And therefore, it behooves the rest of the world, particularly neighbors like ours, to start following events much more carefully. And I really want to explain to the younger viewers that you have for your podcast that what happens in China is not a matter of simply academic interest or passing interest, because it is an $18 trillion economy. And the impact that might take place on our economy, on jobs in India, on banking services in India, on currency in India, on the stock market in India, because of certain developments in China, will affect the lives of millions of ordinary Indians as well. That is why I feel that a much greater interest needs to be taken on China and what is happening in China by young Indians.
But just safe to say, as a follow up to what you have said, that despite the domestic fault lines within China, when it comes to the youth in China, the sentiment would still be a dominating one on the glue, that binds when it comes to a reunification of Taiwan by hook or by crook.
I think so. I think there is an emotional element attached to it, and complete rationality does not prevail on either side. By either side, I don't mean China and Taiwan, I mean China and the United States. It would be a great error for the West to presume that China's economic interests are so great that it might not risk an adventure to fulfill a greater national ambition. We have seen this in the First and Second World Wars, where countries have overreached. On the other hand, I think it would be a mistake for China too to assume that if it does attempt a military takeover of Taiwan, the West will not respond beyond a few platitudes. Because if we see the response the West has made on the Ukraine, my gut feeling is that the response on Taiwan will be much greater, simply because the economic and geopolitical interests of the United States and of a number of other players in the region is much greater where Taiwan is concerned as compared to Ukraine. So, what I am saying is that on both sides, the presumption that the other side will act rationally would be ill advised. There is an emotional quotient, and in the case of China, it is very much a desire of the whole population to reunite.
So before I come to the last set of questions centered around India's approach, just because we also tend to break down some of the complex aspects for the unversed, for the younger people on the podcast, what does the historical evidence point to China's sovereignty claim over Taiwan? I mean, you did mention the Cairo Agreement, you mentioned about India's diplomatic position we took in 1949, but there is the Taiwanese agreement, argument that they have been separate from China historically, that there is evidence. Your thoughts on it?
Well, I think there is enough documented evidence to establish that at least for the last 300 to 400 years, the island of Taiwan and the other outer islands have been administered from the mainland of China under the Qing Empire and subsequently, or rather under the Qing Empire. Now, essentially, there was a war between China and Japan in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, and under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the island of Taiwan and certain other islands were ceded to the Japanese. And as we can well imagine, because we also were victims of imperial aggression, these weren't ceded voluntarily. We may have couched it in terms of a treaty, a Sino-Japanese treaty, but the fact is that these were seized by force. And it was recognized as such. So during the Second World War, at the Cairo Conference in 1943, the big powers, the major powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Soviet Russia, agreed that when the war was over, because China was their ally, the islands would return to Chinese sovereignty. And this was reiterated at the Potsdam Conference after Germany was defeated in May 1945. So, both in terms of historical evidence and in terms of international law, those islands belong to the People's Republic of China. They were not returned in 1950 because if you remember, the Chinese attacked across the 38th parallel in Korea, and because of the Sino-US conflict on the Korean peninsula and the subsequent disruption in their relations, the islands continued to be recognized by the United States until 1979 as the real China, and therefore reunification was not possible.
Thanks for that explanation and background, Ambassador Gokhale. So, very quickly towards the end, I mean, in your working paper, you argue against the commonplace view that India played no role in crisis management during the earlier Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1944, of 54, 55, and 58, and that this is incorrect. So, tell our listeners a little bit about why you feel that this is a misplaced notion.
We recognize China as the legitimate, we recognize the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government in 1949 over all of China. And that included the island of Taiwan and the outlying islands. Now, that did not mean that if there was any disruption of peace and stability around that area, that we would take a hands-off approach. In fact, we took a hands-on approach. But what happened over the subsequent decades after 1962 was that Taiwan became a sort of black hole in the Indian public consciousness. There was no sense that here was this island and the island's security was linked to our security, and increasingly because Taiwan developed economically, the island's economy was linked to our economy. The view was that since we had recognized Taiwan as a part of China, there was no further business to discuss relating to China-Taiwan relations. We completely overlooked the fact that what happens in the Taiwan Straits impacts us, and increasingly impacts us more and more as our economy grows. So as I point out in the paper, there are 4 distinct impacts that a crisis in the Taiwan Strait will have on our economy. It will, of course, affect shipping, and that means trade. So all businesses and jobs related to exports will be affected. It will affect supply chains because China is the manufacturer of the world. So even if you are not exporting to China, if you are import dependent on China, and even if you are exporting to the West, your business and your jobs will get affected. The third, of course, is semiconductors, and we do understand that as a services-driven economy, everything, all your e-platforms, your e-commerce, your logistics, your entertainment industry, your gaming industry, your education industry now depends on semiconductors. A disruption in supplies will affect millions of jobs in the services sector. And finally, as I pointed out, the submarine cables that go between India's Silicon Valley, Bengaluru or Hyderabad or Mumbai, and the American Silicon Valley, many of them are transiting through Taiwan. And therefore, if submarine cables are cut or damaged, your IT enabled services collapse. Now, the reason I'm flagging this is we have had tiny incidents, and I believe these are not by chance, of all these happening. China in March this year is believed to have cut the submarine cable between the main island of Taiwan and the offshore islands of Kinmen and Matsu. Similarly, China did disrupt shipping in the Taiwan Straits for 3 or 4 days after Nancy Pelosi's visit. China has enforced a greater aerial presence over Taiwan, which has raised the risk of mishap in both on the sea and in the air. And these, I don't believe, are by chance. I think they are testing the waters and developing the capacities. Therefore, the point I'm making is, it is our business to ensure that peace and stability prevails in the Taiwan Straits, and we should be concerned if peace and stability is affected by whichever party is going to disrupt that peace and stability.
But does this hold an important place in India's conversations with the United States, even in your time? Today the US, of course, raises the issue of Ukraine war. Is India in a position to mediate or intervene in any sort of a way in the Taiwan Strait crisis?
I think mediation is completely out of the question. As my paper shows, even in the 1950s, our efforts to mediate did not succeed. At that time, at least, we had a reasonably equidistant position between the two powers. Today, our relationship with China, in the words of our own External Affairs Minister, are not normal. And therefore, I think mediation is ruled out. But what we can do is lend our considerable diplomatic weight and influence in the region and beyond the region to make others aware of the implications of a crisis and to build a public voice that urges all the parties concerned to maintain the status quo until the people of Taiwan are ready to reunify with the mainland. And here we should not underestimate India's capacity. Given the size of our economy, the growing diplomatic influence, the regional respect, I think that if we make our voice heard and in a rational way, explaining to others what the implications for them will be of a crisis on their economies and their societies and their national security, I believe that we will be a voice that counts.
So, Ambassador Gokhale, you explained, of course, why India needs to watch. India and Indians need to continuously watch the ongoing events within China and the broad areas of concerns if this were to flare up into an actual attack situation. What would the ramification of such a crisis also be for the line of actual control?
That's difficult to say, Smita, because my presumption is that we don't have to have a crisis in the Taiwan Strait to have a crisis on the line of actual control, as we have seen since 2013 and very clearly in 2020. So I think it would be a misperception to link the two. Yes, of course, a crisis in the Taiwan Strait will have implication for what happens in the India-China border region. But I don't think that if there is no crisis in the Taiwan Strait, nothing will happen in the India-China border region. It is important to delink the two. Now, so far as the linkage is established, I would think it is only to the extent that China may be concerned about opening more than one front. And this will certainly be a part of strategic planning. It has to be. After all, we are on the opposite side and our relationship is not normal. So certainly as part of that planning, scenario planning, they would have assumed various postures that India might adopt. India might be neutral, India might be tilted towards the United States, India might be more accommodative towards China, and worked on various scenarios. Now, I'm not aware as to which one of these will happen, because I think this is difficult to predict at this particular point of time. It involves a whole set of interesting dynamics, including how our relations with the United States develops under the next administration, which may or may not be a Biden administration, how relations with India, with China will develop over the next 4 to 5 years, and how our relations with the region will develop. Because as we have just seen, our foreign minister is in Bangkok and has conducted a series of meetings from BIMSTEC to ASEAN to a number of other Mekong Ganga cooperation. So obviously, this too will impact on how we act in any crisis.
Right. So, Dr. Jaishankar, of course, being in Bangkok on 17th of July when we are recording this podcast, which leads me to my final question, then Ambassador Gokhale, because as you said that, of course, it is difficult to gauge which way will India go. But to quote from the US think tank paper, that's also a part of the paper that you have written, which says that countries like Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, India would be concerned about Chinese encroachment, but also fear Chinese power. Given the increased Indian proximity with the US led West, the kind of technology, defense co development we are talking about the US now, the foundation agreements, the logistical pacts, can India remain a passive participant in the wake of a possible military escalation in Taiwan?
So, firstly, I want to just make it clear, Smita, that I don't think the American paper, which characterizes India as having a fear of China, is correct. I think that we have systematically overcome the 1962 syndrome. There may be vestiges here and there, but they are certainly not in our military or in our government. I think that if anything, the actions, not just the words, the deeds after 2020 taken by the government of India have clearly demonstrated that fact. Now, as far as what we might do with the United States is concerned, yes, there is absolutely no doubt that the sort of arrangements we have established with the United States in the military field are very, very significant. But almost all of these, or perhaps all of them to the best of my knowledge, are related to peacetime activities. We do not have a treaty with the United States as Japan or Australia have, or even some limited arrangements like Singapore and Thailand and the Philippines have, to come to the assistance of the United States in a concrete way during a conflict. So, therefore, my sense is that India's actions at that time will be determined not just by our relationship with the United States, but what China does. And on that basis, it's very difficult to predict what China or the United States might do. Therefore, I think that I'm sure that our military and diplomatic planners are working on various contingencies, but I'm not in government, and therefore it's virtually impossible for me to make even an educated guess in that regard.
Well, I think, of course, a part of the foreign policy role is really about trying to read the tea leaves when you can, even if you're not able to crystal gaze precisely, but prepare for the worst case scenarios too. It's always enlightening to listen into your insights, Ambassador Gokhale. And of course, once again, to our listeners and to our viewers, do pick up, read that Carnegie paper that he has authored on how India's approach to the Taiwan Strait crisis. His books, of course, are a very important read for anybody interested in the region. As we conclude, Ambassador Gokhale, would you like to, in fact, recommend any other reading, a book, or maybe a film or something to do with the region and in China in particular?
Well, there have been a couple of good books on the region. There is a book by the former National Security Advisor, Mr. Shivshankar Menon, on India and Asian geopolitics. That's an excellent book. And of course, you have a recent book, which is very interesting on how China looks at India and the world by Mr. Shyam Saran, who was the former Foreign Secretary. I think there are plenty of good books written by many Indians out there. What is more important is young Indians need to recognize that China will impact their lives in many ways and start taking a greater interest in China in particular and international relations in general. So I really think podcasts like yours play that bridge between the policymaker and public opinion.
Thank you so much. And thanks once again for your time. That's all that we have on this episode of Beyond Nation and State. Do not forget to download the Sunu India app. You can also listen in to all the previous episodes on the Apple and Spotify podcasts. And if you tune in, do leave your ratings on the apps as well as share your feedback with us. I am on Twitter as Smita underscore Sharma. You can look me up on Instagram as Smita Sharma Journalist. Thanks for listening in as well as for watching this podcast.